Hi, everybody. I think we're going to get started now. My name is Shouka Rezvani, and I'm the chair of the Nonprofit and Tax-Exempt Entities Practice Group at Tonkon Torp. I have 25 years of experience counseling nonprofit organizations, and I'm today's moderator. Welcome to our webinar called Serving on a Nonprofit Board in a Pandemic. Our hope is to provide you with practical advice today so that your organizations can thrive. If you have any questions unique to your entity, we invite you to reach out to any of us directly or to the Tonkon Torp lawyers you normally work with to discuss your specific situation. Today, we will hear from two panelists. We have Rob Greenman, a lead advisor at Vista Capital Partners, and Claire Brown, who's an experienced partner in Tonkon Torp's business department. Let me make a quick note about our webinar format. First, we are recording this webinar. You do not need to sign a disclosure, and no private information of yours will be shared. Please know, however, that should you choose to participate in our Q&A section, your question may be recorded in association with your name. Feel free to submit questions in the Q&A section of your Zoom app located at the bottom of your bar. I will do my best to ask each panelist a few questions as they come up. We want to be sure to have time for all of the panelists. So if I don't ask your question right away, please wait for the end. And because situations are changing so rapidly, both legally and in terms of the pandemic and other things, know that we may not know the answer to your question right now. And if it becomes too nuanced or specific to your organization to address in this webinar format with everyone present, we may welcome you to reach out to one of us or to the Tonkon attorney that you normally work with. At the end of our presentation, we'll conclude with a Q&A session, and we'll try to hit as many of your questions as we can. We welcome any feedback that you wish to provide after this webinar. If there are topics you want to hear about, let us know. We're looking for more opportunities to serve our local community by providing additional webinars in the future. Finally, the information that's presented here is as of today, June 10th, and is not intended to provide legal advice. So let's go ahead and get our program started. I'm going to start with you, Claire. Welcome. Can you provide an overview of the duties of nonprofit board members and comment on how they might have changed because of the pandemic? Have they changed?
Yes, they have not changed, and I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Even though so much about the world feels like it's shifted fundamentally, things like federal and state law governing nonprofits, and in almost every case I would imagine, the articles, bylaws, and policies of any nonprofit are as they always were. So I think it's important, and I made a quick list here. I think it's important to keep in mind that board members do owe basic duties to a nonprofit of which they belong. And fundamentally, board members are obligated to steward the nonprofit, which means actively participating in the governance of the nonprofit, staying informed, and keeping the nonprofit's mission at the forefront of the activities of the nonprofit. I want to just briefly go over some of the duties that board members owe. First, the duty of care, which means that the board members are informed and use common sense when they reach their decisions. Things like attending board meetings, asking questions, and thinking critically about information that's presented. That's really important and remains important, even though it's hard to do, have perfect focus over a Zoom meeting and we're all multitasking, but that hasn't changed and board members still have that obligation. Second, the duty of loyalty. The nonprofit has to come first, so transactions that are potentially conflicted, continue to be pretty careful about those. And then the duty of obedience, and that just means following the law and following the nonprofit's internal governance. That this remains, very important, and I want to encourage board members to not lose sight of this, even though there's a lot else going on, certainly.
Rob, I was going to turn to you and ask, are there any specific investment policies or procedures that boards should pay particular attention to now? I think you're still muted, Rob.
There we go. Thank you, Shouka. Yes, definitely. You know, the good news here is that, you know, nonprofits have already done the work here, and you know, you already have an investment policy in place, and this can be something that can really be, it's like your best friend during times like this, right? And there's two critical parts to the investment policy today that are probably worth kind of getting real comfortable with and familiar with. And the first one is, you know, the asset allocation and the investments that are within this endowment portfolio, if one does exist within a nonprofit. And, you know, the best thing about an investment policy during volatile time periods is it can be something you can fall back on and say, okay, look, I've done all the work, I've made the plan, and now it's just time to work the plan, right? And so, you know, here we are in June, and for those paying attention to the markets, we're basically back flat to where we were at the very beginning of the year, which is kind of staggering. But it wasn't much, you know, just a couple months ago in March when things had fallen quite a bit. And so the investment policy can just be a really nice thing to come back to and just say, you know, what should we be doing right now? Because a lot of times reacting feels like the right thing. So as board members, you can come back to that investment policy and say, okay, you know what? We've already done this. It's put in writing. We're either taking care of it or we've hired folks to take care of it on our behalf. And this is what is going to guide our decisions, because we made all these decisions in a period of calm, not really of like distress. So I'd say that's the big one. The other one that I'd really like to talk about at some time today is about withdrawals, because I think some folks got, especially when portfolios were weighed down in March, I think folks were very worried about, you know, should we be revisiting the discussion about withdrawals? And, you know, the good news here that is really that the answer is no. Now is not the time that we should be revisiting, just like the investments. We don't need to revisit these discussions about can we still withdraw funds, or should we still withdraw funds, or should we change that? And so I have a few slides at some point that I want to come back to really just kind of inform folks and make them feel more comfortable with and understand these withdrawal policies and what the long-term implications are.
Do you want to go ahead with that, Rob? Because I think that can really help frame up the decision making for a lot of boards. I mean, I think a natural reaction can be, let's go ahead and invade our endowment fund, and you know, we need to be paying staff.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
there's
for
a real
sure.
sense of panic, so it might not be a bad time to talk about that.
You bet, you bet. And so just to give it some context, I think it's important to kind of like, if we rewind the clock a little bit here and think about endowment management and how it's evolved over time, you know, really, if we go back, gosh, almost like 60 years now, back in the 60s, the Ford Foundation actually had some pioneering research that came out where they said, you know, rather than just focusing on income from a portfolio for an endowment, we should really be looking at this total return approach, which it was actually a huge important step for endowments, because up until that point, most endowments just simply said, hey, we can take this money and put it in here, but we can only withdraw back to the operating fund. We can only withdraw any income that comes out of it. And so by and large, before this pioneering research came out, it was pretty much just a portfolio, put it in bonds, and whatever interest came off of those bonds was like the old clipping your coupons, right? And that's simply what you had to give back to the endowment on an ongoing basis. And so the Ford Foundation really showed in the 60s that, you know, instead we can be looking at returns from a really different perspective. And it can, you know, just allow you to have more robust payout to the beneficiaries, in this case, the endowment. And so that kind of gave birth to, in 1972, there was, UMIFA came out, and it essentially, it encouraged folks to adopt this total return approach. So that was a groundbreaking kind of step in how folks look at endowment and withdrawal strategies from these endowments. The next kind of that came after 1972 was in 2006. They added another initial just to make it a little bit more official and went to UPMIFA. And the nice thing that UpMIFA did was it gave some clarity, and the attorneys can speak more eloquently to exactly what else UpMIFA did. But from an investment management perspective, the nice thing it did is it gave some clarity about what happens when an endowment is underwater. Or if we were talking back in March when portfolios were down 20%, let's say, can you still invade principal, or can you still do that? And it kind of shed some light on that and talked and gave boards a little bit of context there. So with that backdrop, I want to share a screen and talk about the withdrawal strategy that most endowments are using today. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over here in a moment. Okay. Hopefully, can you see that okay? Okay. So, the withdrawal strategy that most endowments are using is this percentage of a moving average, okay? So there's really 4 different types of withdrawal strategies if you had to break them down quite simply. This is the one that, according to the colleges and endowments that have a study that kind of track all this, and while that's not representative of all nonprofits, it's certainly a large percentage. 73% of folks are using this type of withdrawal strategy. So that's the one I'm going to focus on when we talk about today, the impact of withdrawals. So a percentage of a moving average, it's 73% because it's a really darn good policy average, actually. And what it is exactly is it says, rather than just take a percentage of the withdrawal every single year and take that out as a withdrawal to the operating fund, is they go back and they look at, for example, the last 3 years. So for example, most nonprofits or a lot use a fiscal period of June 30th. So we've got one coming up here at the end of this month. So you would look at June 30th, 2020, June 30th, 2019, June 30th, 2018. You would take an average of those 3 years. Some also, rather than just having 3 data points, might use a quarterly average. Okay, so there'd be 12 data points there. And the really nice thing about that is that if you have an environment where portfolios are going up and up and up in value, if you're worried about, well, gosh, if we apply this, for example, 5% withdrawal to today's high value, how is that going to impact things, and is it too much? And it's going to use these lower values to kind of dampen that withdrawal. On the other side of things, if you're in a period like in 2008, 2009, where portfolios are way down in value, it's going to be buoyed a little bit because it's going to have those previous years to bring up that withdrawal average, okay? So this is the type of policy that is in the lion's share of investment policies in terms of a withdrawal. What I thought might be really helpful is to just get comfortable with what does that mean and what can you expect from this type of withdrawal policy. So to put it in context, if we look at the last 20 years, a 20-year portfolio that is invested in largely, this is a typical pension portfolio or endowment portfolio, 60% in the S&P 500, 40% in bonds, a very, typical kind of mix for this type of portfolio. You can see that the last 20 years has actually been, there have been some tough times thrown at investors, starting with the dot-com bubble coming off, of course, 2008. So it's been a really kind of tough 20-year time period. But I thought also this might just be an interesting time period to say, well, what if you started in an endowment 20 years ago and applied this 5% moving average? What would it look like, right? And not adjusting it in any times, good or bad. How does it kind of play out? So here's the good news and why folks really like this withdrawal policy and what you should be able to expect if one of the organizations that you're involved with or care about use this policy. Is this kind of dotted line, what it's representing is it's showing you the annual draw that's calculated by using this policy based on the actual market returns that we saw, right? So despite in years when 2008 occurs and we have a large drawdown, because it's buoyed again by those previous years, what you're seeing is a relatively flat line, right? You're seeing about $50,000 a year, plus or minus. It drops down to maybe 40, and then it comes up a little bit here at the tail end in 2020. But we're really seeing like a pretty smooth experience. And that's why this is so great, right? Is that from a nonprofit perspective, you can think, okay, you know, even in 20-year time period where markets maybe weren't great and we experienced some really tough times, it's a very smooth experience and what you could expect from that type of withdrawal policy. What folks sometimes are worried about is like, well, how's that impacting the portfolio and the longevity? And as a board member, my duties and as far as ensuring that I'm doing the right thing for the future, right? And so the next slide is simply showing you the portfolio value of this endowment with these withdrawals coming out. So if you're just Rip Van Winkle and never looked at the portfolio value and took your 5% withdrawal ongoing, you can see if you just fast forward from 2000 all the way to 2020, we're a little bit north of that $1 million starting amount. So it did not invade principal over that 20 time year period. It actually went up a tiny bit. There certainly were time periods like 2008, 2009, where it dipped down quite a bit, but employing that moving average really worked out pretty well, right? And so, you know, this kind of combines the two and can show you, you know, ultimately portfolio value in the line chart, the withdrawal strategy. And so I think what I was trying to show with this and where folks can start to get comfortable with understanding that with this withdrawal policy is that the good news here is like, if you can really just start to get comfortable with the withdrawal policy, you can refocus those conversations as board members about other types of really important decisions for this group that you care so much about. Maybe that's about programming or something else, but it can sometimes be a little bit distracting when you're thinking about this pool of funds in terms of, should we be changing the allocation? Should we be changing the withdrawal policy? And I think really the answer is no. Now is not the time to be doing that. And just remembering that you put a lot of thought into, and you and past board members, frankly, too, into what those policies are, and they're probably very appropriate.
Thanks, Rob. I think that was a really helpful reminder to boards that, you know, a lot of times making decisions in times of stress is the reason we have these policies, is to have something to fall back on so that that stress doesn't influence us when we're not in the right emotional state to make decisions.
Yeah.
And that's true across the board for much of the reasons why the policies exist in the first place. So very good reminder. Claire, I mean, I think that is a really helpful discussion in terms of those organizations that have an endowment fund, right? Many organizations don't have an endowment and are far from that financial position. And even so, some of those that do have endowments have other reasons that, you know, they're not receiving their traditional sources of income right now, whether that's because of programming that's been disrupted or fundraising that has been disrupted. So what are some of the other resources that nonprofits should consider accessing right now?
Good question. I put together a list of things that I want to highlight as potential financial resources for nonprofits. Not exhaustive, obviously, but just things to keep in mind to the extent if the board hasn't yet had time to consider them or hasn't thought that they could apply. So first, the Paycheck Protection Program, which everyone's seen in the news, and it ran out of money and then got more money. As of today, this webinar, it still has a lot of funding. For a while, it was going up as people returned returned the funds that they'd been dispersed, they'd received earlier. I want to, I'll give a brief overview of the Paycheck Protection Program and how it could help nonprofits, but I want to say we've had many webinars, many articles specifically about the PPP, and there's lots of resources on our website with details. So if you're interested in how it might affect your organization or you have a specific question, we do have resources that can help you, and many attorneys who are up to speed on all the latest developments. But I'm just, for purposes of this, because of time and the other things we have to talk about, I'm going to do just kind of a quick overview. So the PPP is through the Small Business Administration. The SBA is able to make loans to qualifying businesses with through that business's lender or community bank or that type of resource. So a business will apply. They are entitled to borrow up to 2.5 times their average monthly payroll from 2019. And that's fully loaded payroll. So it includes employer contributions to retirement, employer tax obligations, that sort of thing. And then, so some businesses, I have one nonprofit that we work with that did some staff downsizing in early 2020, and this actually worked out pretty well for them because that's not taken into account. Their 2019 payroll was a lot higher. So, you know, the simple rules can sometimes be a big benefit. The loan then is very low interest with pretty favorable repayment terms, or depending on how the funds are used, all or a portion of it could be forgiven entirely. So this is a way to get cash in the door to keep your staff on the payroll. That's how the loan gets forgiven, to simplify, is if you use it for mostly for payroll expenses. I also want to talk about the Oregon Work-Share program. So this is available to Oregon employers that cut staff hours. So if your hourly workers have their salaries, or their hours cut between 20 and 40%, through this Oregon Work-Share program, the employer, including nonprofits, can sign up, and then the staff whose hours have been reduced has access to a portion of the unemployment benefit that they would otherwise receive had they been laid off. So this is a really good way to save some money on the organization side while mitigating the effect on staff from reducing their hours. And depending on how much is being cut and how much staff are making, and people who are collecting unemployment right now get a $600 benefit every week. So it could end up, you know, really offsetting some of what would otherwise be a financial hit for staff by signing up for this program. So that's definitely something to consider if you haven't yet. I also want to, so if you get Tonkon emails, you've seen things about business interruption insurance. Look at your insurance policy. It's possible that a nonprofit has business interruption coverage if, for example, its programs are meant to generate revenue and it can't hold the programs because of a global pandemic. You might have access to some insurance coverage for that, and it's at least worth taking a look, or talking to your broker about it. You know, your Tonkon attorney can also take a look if you think that would be helpful. Now, as we've kind of alluded to, now is a really good time to think about your fundraising efforts on an ongoing basis. I think that's a very appropriate discussion for the board to have. Organizations whose fundraising is dependent on, for example, a large gala that takes place indoors in the winter months or something, it is going to be, even if such an event is legal at the time and can be held, convincing people to come might be a real challenge. So now is the time to kind of take a step back and think about how fundraising might look into the future. And I think it's also appropriate for boards to consider whether the organization should combine its efforts or some of its resources with other organizations, either locally or nationally, to think about reimagining how the nonprofit might look and whether that is in the furtherance of the mission.
Thanks, Claire. I think that's really helpful. I think a lot of nonprofits perhaps don't realize that with a work-share program, by doing a minor reduction, a 20% reduction in salary reduction, that they might qualify for those unemployment benefits, which will then automatically qualify their staff to receive the $600 per week federal additional stimulus payment, which might mean that they end up actually making more money. So for those that really do need to consider a staffing reduction for the overall health of the organization, but are fearful of affecting their employees, that can be a really good option to consider, at least as long as the federal program continues.
Yes, definitely.
So Rob, have there been any changes in the tax laws that you think our development folks who are on the call should be aware of in terms of things that might really prompt donors to think more about giving right now?
Yeah, thanks, Shouka. There have been, and before we dive into, the CARES Act did have a couple of things that we can talk about that impact specifically just 2020, but I think it's actually helpful, regardless of this current environment, is to remember what's been happening the previous couple of years. And if we look at a couple of different tax laws that I want to highlight, I think this is sharing here. I think it's helpful from a development standpoint to really understand some different nuances that can be going on with your high net worth donors that might like giving shares of stock or other kind of tax savvy approaches rather than just a gift of cash. So the big one that occurred was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And so when that occurred, when that occurred, you saw this real big shift in, when that occurred, you saw a big shift in the number of folks that were itemizing to compared to those that suddenly didn't anymore. And so the itemized deduction folks went from 30% to 10%. And that was huge. And when that occurred, basically, what happened was folks that perhaps were suddenly not itemizing might not be getting a charitable deduction for their gifts of stock. And so because of that law, and one of the questions that came in through our chat I saw is that there was this huge rush to go into these donor advised funds. And the reason that was occurring was folks were worried that they weren't going to be getting this deduction for a charitable gift. And so a very common strategy that started to come out from a tax planning and wealth management standpoint was this bunching of charitable gifts. And you saw this huge influx into these donor advised funds where suddenly folks were taking 3, 4, 5, maybe 10 years worth of their charitable giving, putting it into the donor advised fund so they got them above that itemized deduction threshold to make sure they got the deduction. And just so folks are aware, I mean, I think what the real game plan for these folks was get the deduction and don't change your charitable giving, but put it in there and then continue to give it out, but ensure that you still got the deduction. So that was the game plan that a lot of folks were following. And so you saw this huge influx of money going into donor advised funds with the plan of giving it out over time. And so you saw that occurring. And so from a development standpoint, certainly, letting folks know that have donor advised funds that they can send their, grants that way to you, that you can receive those is helpful. There's some little kind of small things on the margin you can do that can make it easier. Fidelity Charitable, for example, a nonprofit can go to Fidelity Charitable and set up almost like the equivalent of electronic funds transfer. Rather than Fidelity Charitable sending them a check out of the donor advised fund, you can actually get an electronic funds transfer, which was a real problem in March because we certainly heard from a number of folks that issued grants out of their donor advised fund, but with this remote environment we're in, there were some checks that sat in mailboxes and actually got returned to the donor advised funds that the charity never got, right? So anything that folks can do to streamline that process, it also, of course, speeds up the time in which you can get funds from those grants. But so I think just recognizing that this kind of like change in donor advised funds is out there, and just being savvy to that and speaking to your audience that way is really helpful. The other big change that occurred was IRA gifts. So folks, there used to be kind of a patchwork law that year by year they would kind of give the blessing on so late in the year that a lot of advisors didn't have enough time to really use it as a plan. But they did a couple years ago go back and say, you know what, this is now going to be in place until we say it's not. And so a lot of folks were able to take money out of an IRA and they could give it directly to charity. And so that became a huge trend in charitable giving, that folks were giving, once they were over a certain age, they were giving money out of their IRAs directly to charity. And that trend is probably just going to continue. And so I think it's really kind of a next level thing for folks in development is to understand, certainly they don't need to be tax advisors or anything, but understanding that dynamic and kind of speaking to your audience and engaging them that way and letting them know that perhaps you might be able to squeeze a little bit more juice out of the lemon by letting them know their dollars can go a little further by doing it this way. I think those are helpful things to keep in mind for folks in development.
Is there anything else specific to CARES Act that you think has an impact on donor giving that our folks on the call might be interested in hearing about?
Yeah, I think, the big one that's really great is there's now this $300 cash contribution that can occur above the line. So for folks that in the past, if you weren't itemizing and you did this contribution, you might not get a deduction for it. But now anyone this year can give $300 of cash directly to a charity. It can't go to a donor advised fund. It can't go to a private foundation. It needs to go to these entities that really need the money, right? And so now anyone can do $300. So I would probably market that from a development standpoint and remind them of that. That's a good one. The other one that's really nice this year is that there used to be a 60% cap of your adjusted gross income on cash contributions. Well, they raised that to 100% in 2020. So for folks that want to give cash, not appreciated securities, but cash directly to charity, it now can be 100% reduction of AGI, which that can be a really nice planning tool. It opens the doors to kind of some tax savvy, at the high end of things. You can really start to do some interesting things there, but those are the two probably big ones. I'd say the lowest hanging fruit is that $300 one above the line deduction that folks should really be trying to take advantage of.
Thanks, Rob, about that. Claire, what legal actions should we telling our boards to be keeping in mind during this pandemic?
Yeah, first a quick note about that $300. My alma mater was on it. They emailed me about it right away. So it's out there. I think there are a few things that I would like to remind board members to keep in mind, just because it's, there's so much going on, but these are potential pitfalls that I think I want to just let people know that don't lose sight of these. So first, nonprofits have public funds, so your obligation is to steward them for the public benefit. So there's a concept of private inurement where public funds go to an individual in an impermissible way. There might be a situation where your ED's spouse got laid off due to COVID, and you might know that they're struggling financially, but authorizing a one-time COVID bonus or something is probably not a good use of nonprofit funds. So just keep in mind that the funds should be used in furtherance of the mission and not for an individual. I also want to remind, and no one's going to be surprised to hear me say this, but if there are restrictions on funds, they do need to be respected. So if you have funds that were going to enable you to hire someone and the funds came to the nonprofit restricted because they could only be used for this new position, for example, even if you get other funds through the Paycheck Protection Program or something, you can't necessarily redirect those funds towards another use without the permission of the donor. If they're not restricted and you had just been planning to use them that way, then that's a different story. But another situation that I recently ran across was funds that were earmarked in support of a certain programming event that can't take place. Well, you really do need to go back to the donor and say, well, this event can't take place. Can we use these for another event or add them to our general operations?
Can I interject there, Claire? That actually semi-answers one of the questions that has come up on the chat, which was, what about quasi-endowed funds? And, quasi-endowment, it depends on what causes the restriction that makes it a quasi-endowment. Usually that means that the board has created a board restriction. And so it's really important to look at what was the purpose behind the restriction. Does that purpose still exist? Is it created by, usually a quasi-endowment is not a restriction created by a donor. And if it's a donor restriction, and you're trying to remove it, there may be additional steps you have to jump through that may not exist if it was a board restriction, that now because of using their independent business judgment, it makes sense to go ahead and change those restrictions. So let you continue.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I don't know how to check the Q&A, so thank you. I also want to have a quick note about lobbying and political activity. So nonprofits, take positions of all the time. There should be more arts funding in schools or whatever, and that's different than you should vote for X measure because it supports funds in schools, or you should support X candidate because they're for more funds in schools. It is, there's a lot going on, and it's really easy to slip into a lobbying posture, and just be aware that you need to be so careful about doing that. And if you want to do it, you need to do it with intention and with appropriate counseling so that you don't imperil your nonprofit's status and your operations. And I also, just a note about employment issues, this is an area where nonprofits get tripped up a lot in the best of times. And now we've got things like, different rules about leave, and new anti-discrimination, potential anti-discrimination issues. For example, a workplace might just assume that a pregnant employee won't want to come back physically to the office without asking, and that's a bad idea. So our labor and employment group has done a lot of work in keeping people aware through webinars and articles of how these things are changing. But there are new rules all the time about closing a workplace, opening a workplace safely, potential employer liability related to employees coming back to the workplace, pitfalls in employment. And this is, nonprofits have kind of a hard time with this anyway, and now it's even more fraught because of all of the potential employment pitfalls. So just keep employment issues at the forefront of your mind if they're not already.
Thanks for that. And I was going to say and I think you bring up a really good point about the lobbying versus political activities. And some people don't understand the difference there. Political activities are related to promoting a candidate for public office. That's strictly prohibited at all times. You just cannot do that as a nonprofit organization, which is something a lot of nonprofits don't realize. I think because they'll feel like, well, this candidate is espousing things that would be to the benefit of our organization. So of course we support them. And you have to really keep in mind that as a nonprofit, you can't support a political candidate. And lobbying, which is where you're trying to, get certain legislative changes or acts done, can be done, but in a really de minimis amount, and has to be done under certain guidelines. So again, like you were saying, Claire, I think that's so important to mention, especially in times when there are strong feelings and real feelings about we should be doing something, we should be taking a stance, and how you do that, you have to really think about as a nonprofit. So a good reminder, I think. So Rob, I think we've talked sort of about a lot of the negatives and all the reasons to feel stressed and challenged during these times, and there's certainly real feelings. But what should we tell nonprofits to feel optimistic about?
Well, I'd say a few things. The fact that now today, markets are almost even with where we opened the year, that's unbelievable, right? There are stocks that investors could give to nonprofits that are still at a gain, right? Which is great. But even what's kind of amazing is that even if you looked back in March when things were way down, and you might think that giving would just be completely suppressed, there was still some great data coming out. Fidelity Charitable, which is one of the larger donor advised funds out there, they conducted a survey, and there was really some great positive news on donor intent. So they surveyed 64 different community foundations, and grants from these donor advised funds, they actually increased 58% in March and April over that same time period last year from 2019. So that's incredible, right? And that's before really a lot of things came back from the market perspective. So they went back and they asked all these donors, they said, what's your plan? This is in the midst of everything, in really bad times in March. And they said, we understand what's going on, but what is your plan for the rest of this year? 25% of them actually said they plan to increase donations. And so I would say that's something to be really optimistic about, right? Is that folks are engaged right now. Even 54% said we're planning on doing exactly the same, even if our situation has become really difficult. So I think that, you know, it's kind of incredible. I know for us at Vista, you know, we've been having a lot of conversations with clients, and honestly, the thing, you know, our whole core purpose is to build happier and more prosperous lives. And I got to tell you, the conversations that we've been having with clients, despite, you know, all the volatility with markets, they're about the things that matter most to them. And you know, obviously family is right up there, but the clients that we work with, the nonprofits that they love and care so dearly about, they are super high on their list, and people want to support right now more than ever. And so I think that being really engaged with your donor base and more communication, I think there's plenty of reason to be optimistic and lots of sunshine ahead.
Thanks for that. I think a lot of people right now, especially in the nonprofit community, hesitate to ask, knowing that many families are experiencing challenges. And I think it's true that what we're finding is that the community understands, and those who are able are stepping forward. So as much as you might hesitate, it is a time to support your organization by making those asks even when they're difficult. So I think that's a really good point. Somebody on the Q&A had asked if you could explain more about what donor advised funds are. Did you want to take that, Rob?
Yeah, happy to. Sure. Yeah, so a donor advised fund, it's really just a vehicle of which it's a charitable entity itself. And so a donor can gift securities or cash to this pooled fund where there's lots of different folks that are now part of that pool. And, you know, in the past where the only method of way, you know, there's community foundations and private foundations, a donor advised fund is simply a pool where you put your funds in there. You don't have complete control over them in that now you have to recommend a grant. But if you put, let's say, $10,000 into this donor advised fund, you now have the opportunity to make grants out of this pool of funds. So one reason they're attractive to folks is that you could take a highly appreciated stock. If you bought shares of Amazon or Nike 10 or 20 years ago and they were highly appreciated, you can gift the share of stock into the donor advised fund. And the donor advised fund then captures that value and can diversify or sell it. And it can either leave it in cash, it can reinvest it, but the donor advised fund doesn't pay the taxes. It's the same, that part of the strategy is no different than giving the money directly to a nonprofit, where a lot of nonprofits have these accounts that can accept these donations, sell the stock, you get the same tax benefit, all that. The difference being is now this donor advised fund is you control when you give the money out to the charity. And so, you know, as I mentioned earlier, there's a reason why they became so much more popular, is because so many folks weren't getting the charitable deduction for some of their charitable giving, which is why folks kind of loaded up into these donor advised funds. I think the hope is that the nonprofits would still continue to get this stream coming back in. It might not come to them directly, but it might come through the donor advised fund. That's certainly the hope, at least. And yeah, so does that answer it, I think, Shouka?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's the notion it's an alternative. It can be, the donor advised funds can be set up in different organizations. It can be set up through investment advisor type organizations that have the ability to do so, as well as community foundations. And we have, of course, our amazing Oregon Community Foundation,
for sure.
Southwest Washington, who also have donor advised funds where you can give money, take a current tax deduction, and then have some ability to advise where you'd like money distributed over time. So it's an alternative to setting up your own private foundation and getting a higher tax deduction, and definitely something that donors can think about.
Yeah, and I think that it's, you know, people have mixed feelings about these as a whole, but there can be a lot of ways that they can really be beneficial to, especially nonprofits that maybe don't have an endowment or don't even have an investment portfolio, that it might be very cumbersome to accept a gift of stock, and they might have a donor that really wants to give stock for tax reasons. Well, the nice thing about a donor advised fund is they can give to the donor advised fund, that the donor advised fund can sell the stock and give them a check, and they don't have to go through the administrative hoops of having this financial institution account and figuring out how to sell the stock and how to get the cash and all that. So.
Yeah, and we had a commenter from the audience who was saying that there may be limitations on distributions from the donor advised funds. That's definitely true. And I think that's one of those things of, for those who don't know where they want to make a direct charitable gift from a charity standpoint is always what I think charities most want to see. But there are many times when, because of family considerations or other things from a donor side, maybe there's a desire to dole out funds over time. And certainly we don't want to appear to be promoting one type of giving over another. We just want to make sure folks understand opportunities, and that you as charities know that there are places to look in the community and to try to get some of those funds. We had another person who asked specifically about holding off-site events, holding virtual fundraising events. I don't know if either of you want to talk about that. I can certainly talk a little bit about that, but I don't know if one of you feels like has a desire to answer any questions about virtual fundraising.
I think that is, I mean, being creative with revenue sources is going to be essential. I think even if we get to a place where we can hold events in the state of Oregon, like I said earlier, I mean, getting people to attend is going to be a challenge. An indoor event with other people, especially if your donor base, might skew a little bit older, for example. So, I think virtual events or thinking of different creative ways to generate nonprofit revenue through fundraising through alternative venues is going to be extremely important.
Yeah, and Shouka, that I would just say the same thing before you jump in, is that I think that now is the time to get creative. I remember, I saw on LinkedIn, your colleague James Hine was involved with an organization. I saw that they would deliver the meal to your house so you could have the same experience, right? And so I think that sort of stuff and thinking that way, that's what we have to do today. So, but it does sound like one of my colleagues is on the board and they just held a virtual event, and they just did unbelievable. And they basically matched their numbers, I think, from last year. And so again, that speaks to some of that good news we talked about before. I think donor intent is there.
Right, and I totally agree with you. I think that whether you're, it depends on so much on the type of organization that you have and what type of events you typically hold and why people attend. Is it primarily to have that social experience, or is it primarily to support your organization? And then you can really think about, why do most people attend? How can you try to address the interests of the maximum number of your donors who typically attend your event? I know for some organizations that social aspect or doing a specific activity that they typically do is really key. And so, trying to think about how you can create that same experience virtually is really important. And in other instances, it's not so much that the people really want to be going to a function. And in fact, they're quite happy to sort of pay for the privilege of not having to go to a function, and they'll continue to support at the same level. So I really think you need to think about, your donor base, who you know best, and think about how you can best address the needs that they've expressed. So I totally agree with you on that, Rob. I think that unless you guys have any concluding remarks, we can turn to the Q&A. We've been answering as we've gone, but unless you have any additional specific things you wanted to mention, I can look to some more of the questions on the, okay. So we have one attendee who's asking, is it a bad time to consider the rolling distribution percentage by like changing it from 4.5% to 5%? If that's what you're, if you're doing the rolling averages, is it maybe a time to consider a little shift in that? I'll hand that over to Rob.
Yeah, so I would say this. I mean, the right time to do any of these is, for example, like we often at Vista, like we'll talk about the allocation, the appropriate allocation for anyone, right? The right time to change the allocation isn't because of what's going on in the markets or because of what we think is going to happen in the future with economies or elections or anything like that. The right time to change something is when there's a change in the situation, right? not based on your expectations of what might happen. And so the answer is perhaps that might be the appropriate time to do that. But I guess I would really ask, like, what is the intent, like what's driving that to happen? I think what you'll see, and one thing I didn't get into with this moving average is, if you recall in that slide, we basically showed that if you employ this moving average and you stay disciplined, which by the way should not be taken for granted because most folks don't stay disciplined to the allocation and just get in there and get their hands in there, which they shouldn't. But if you do that, essentially you can expect to have a smooth withdrawal forever. The most important thing for an organization to note is that that's great. However, if you fast forward another 20 years and you're still getting this $50,000 income stream, what's happening is there's the power of inflation has essentially eroded the amount that truly is coming back to the institution. So I would say what's more appropriate moving forward once we get out of some of this crisis mode right now is to say, what's our game plan for adding to these funds over time so that the $50,000 we're getting each year is not $50,000 in yesterday's dollars, but $50,000 in today's dollars.
You're muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Rob. I was just saying thank you for that answer. And I'm just taking a look to see if we have other questions in our Q&A. Not seeing anything right now. So I think what I'm going to do is just give folks a little chance to ask any last questions. And if I don't see anything pop up soon, then we will, because a lot of these have been answered as we went. So I don't think so. All right, I think that that concludes our webinar. I really appreciate our panelists, Claire and Rob, for your insights. And for all of you who are watching, we thank you for doing so. And of course, feel free to reach out if you have any questions for any of us or with your usual Tonkon Torp lawyer that you work with. And we hope you have a good rest of your day. Stay safe, everybody.